slide projector.
I'm the high school tech crew.
I appreciate all of y'all coming today, and this is the first, I realize, lecture of the kind of post-Armenia exhibition. So I am going to try to stick to my time frame, because when I did a dry run in New York, I went overtime. So I'm going to cut things. It's been a great honor to be able to put on an exhibition of your great culture. And last night, when I had a chance to thank a number of people, I realized later that what I failed to adequately thank is the AGBU. The AGBU became involved in the exhibition very early. Much of the public programming was funded by it. And AGBU chapters like yours in California and elsewhere had me lecture before we had the show, so I was telling them about what it would be, and I find it a perfect culmination that I'm talking to you about what we had and what we hope came from it. And Chicago is really a quite wonderful place for me to come to, because literally the first teaching job I had was at the University of Chicago in your Armenian program. I taught there for 1 quarter, and one of the students I had got in touch with me a few months ago, and I saw him when I was in California, because he said that I was the teacher he most enjoyed as he got an MBA. My memory is that the MBA students wrote papers whose formats surprised me, but it's nice to know that I was able to sound more intelligent than I perhaps thought I was at that time. Many people in the Chicago area were important to the exhibition, but none more so than Rachel Gashgarian, whose parents are here. She wrote some of the most important essays for the catalog. She is a brilliant young scholar, and one of the things that I would hope is that this exhibition will help launch the type of scholarship she does into a wider public audience in the future. Others supported the exhibition in many ways. Sonia gave me support when she arrived and enjoyed the show. Vicky Hovanessian helped make contact with the Armenian government so that the discussion of whether or not the government of Armenia would want to send works of art across a large ocean and much of a large continent could begin with the Ministry of Culture of that time and the President's office of that time. And then, as you all undoubtedly all know, right before everything shipped for the exhibition, the government changed. So there was a little while we waited to see whether that would affect the many Armenians who helped fund the exhibition, and none really deserve more thanks for that than the Hagop Kevorkian Fund. Hagop Kevorkian was the major dealer at the, one of the major dealers at the beginning of the 20th century, and the fund he established paid for roughly half of the exhibition, and without that, I don't know that we would have launched. So I want to talk today both to make Sonia happy, because she asked me to, about putting the show together, and to showing you all something about it. And I'm starting with this wonderful photograph of Mount Ararat and Khorvarat, the site of St. Gregory's imprisonment. That was the opening large photograph of the show for those of you who didn't come, and was one of the many photographs by Hawk, who did all of the photography for the show. And with the next one. And as you entered the exhibition, you saw this giant stele, which gave one aspect of the two big themes of the show, and that aspect was your faith, that with the beginning of the 4th century, you convert as a people to Christianity. It does not mean that that's when you first become involved with Christianity. As you know, you're an apostolic church. You go back with St. Thaddeus to the very beginning, and we'll talk about that in, briefly later in the show. But it struck me as we were praying at the beginning, when you put your hands like this, you're using the earliest Christian prayer pose. And as you pray that way, you are going back to your very first conversion. And it was a lovely moment for me. As the lights move around, I think you're going to still need me. So,
I'll
we
play
will
second.
go forward one. This is not going to be the most formal lecture you've ever heard. You make that wrong? Okay. You are watching that stele be erected. Sonia wanted to know how hard it was to do it. This was what one of the people in our department put together. The man in black is Jack Sultanian, an Armenian member who's one of our best conservators. The lady in black is the curator from the History Museum. The woman with her hands on the hips is me. The man in the blue shirt that keeps appearing is the designer for the show. And all those other people are the most important people in the Met. They are the riggers. They move 1,000-ton objects, and if the riggers aren't available, nothing happens. The two ladies in the doorway on the right are the two women. They came with the loans from the History Museum of Armenia. Every lending institution sends couriers. They watch everything being installed. When they are happy, then it is properly installed. And they were distressed. They kept saying to me, you have it backwards, that the image of the Virgin and Child is the front. And I kept saying, yes, but we're trying to show Armenian Christianity, so what matters to us is for the public to be greeted not by the universal Christian faith of the Virgin and Child, but of your specific community's belief through Gregory the Illuminator, and what we believe is King Trident, but certainly a boar-headed man. On the other side, who one of the best and most important reviewers for the show suggested that the reason King Trident would have a boar's head as opposed to some other wild animal is that wild boars were a sign of authority and royalty in Persia, and that he thus represented the Parthian Persian orientation of contemporary Armenia, turning to the west, to Christianity through Gregory the Illuminator, which I hope somebody will follow up on Peter Brown's work further. If you can go to the next one. As you left the big stele, for those of you who were not at the show, you entered the first of a sequence of galleries that we tried largely to group around major sites where Armenians were powerful. And in the first one, we had to use the city of Dvin, because it is now an archaeological site and thus can be dug up, as opposed to Etchmiadzin, which is standing and thus cannot be taken apart and moved to New York. Dvin, which most people don't think about, in the period of the conversion of the Armenians and on into the Middle Ages, so through much of the period of the exhibition, was in fact the second largest city between Constantinople and the east. It was this gigantically important trade route city, which Tamerlane took to the ground and it never rebuilt. So now it's a site that has been dug by archaeologists for the last century quite productively. And we were able to borrow both the image, that stone image with Christ with the weird hair on top of the cross, which is from one of the palatial buildings for the reigning bishop. Dvin is where many of the church councils that led to the Armenian church becoming an independent autocephalous community were held. So in those works, we're looking at you as developing your independent Christianity, and we were able to borrow a small fragment of an early sheet of the Armenian alphabet that had been reused in another book to talk about Metropolitan in the beginning of the Armenian alphabet, created to translate text, the Gospels and such from other languages, and going on to produce great historians like Agatangelos, whom we quote throughout the exhibition. And then the bowl and the jewelry at the bottom are part of the trade routes. So the two themes of the exhibition, your unique Christian tradition and your incredibly and underratedly important role on trade routes, bringing objects from the Far East to the Far West, where you are the linchpin. And one of the first ways we can show that is the map on the right, which is the first map I can find. Are you asking a question? First, okay. One of the The map is the first map I know of in which Armenians tell people where Armenia is. It is drawn at St. Albans Monastery in England, the most important monastery in the 13th century, where Armenian monks are recorded as having visited twice. They're in the journal, the archives of the monastery, and when they are asked where the Mount Ararat is, they say that it is in Armenia, 15 days north of Jerusalem, and the lost lower part of the map is largely Jerusalem, and you go up to the very top, and you see Mount Ararat, and the squiggly lines that are on it with Noah's Ark on top of it are the dragons and snakes that protect it. And in the text, in Latin, it says that the Armenians control all the lands to India. You did not have armies there. But the trade routes, the northern Silk Road must have flowed like a many-branched river into Armenia and through there on to Constantinople, the capital of the Empire of the Romans that we call Byzantium. And one way that we can be sure that you are that important is that a large number of Byzantine emperors are Armenian, and you don't get emperors from places that do not help an empire. So connecting to the Armenian control of the trade routes was significant throughout the Middle Ages. We wanted people to have a sense of what Armenia physically was like, and so we combined photographs and objects. So the next one, please. Through the generosity of the History Museum, we were able to borrow a number of very large, very heavy things, which did not include my understanding that they would have to be shipped on a larger plane than normally flies into Armenia, so it became more complicated. What we wanted to be able to show was like with the church model that I pulled forward at the bottom in the second gallery, what churches look like, because you have an incredibly gorgeous architectural tradition that is built of cubic volumes, cones and squares, rectangles, cylinders, and this is actually the gable roof of a church, we don't know which one so much, that was preserved in the 20th century as archaeologists went and brought things from across the Republic of Armenia into the secular, in a way, the secular sites of the History Museum and the Montenegrin, both of which lent generously. And we will have, for many more years, because we've just signed the papers, one Hajkar. We borrowed a group of Hajkars, which in our time are the great symbol of the Armenians. In the Middle Ages that we are talking about, the great symbol of the Armenians to the Armenians were manuscripts. That the manuscript was the object to be venerated the most. But with the genocide, you have this transfer to an interest in the Hajkar. And when I went to northern Armenia with Jack Sultanian to select this Hajkar from out in front of the castle of Loriberd, we didn't realize that the little rectangle at the base is the head of St. Matthew, and then the lion of St. Mark, and on its side, the ox of St. Luke, and going up the other side, St. John's eagle. So you have the gospel, the word, that is so important to the medieval Armenians. And from it springs the cross, the promise of salvation on this, which would have been a funeral marker. And one which I think it's important to remember was a braver thing to carve than we think about today, when we can have whatever we want on a funerary monument. This area of Loriberd was under a relatively lenient Muslim control in the early 1200s when this would have been carved, and soon after that is destroyed by the Mongols. So that you're in a region in which Islam will come to be very dominant, and to make a statement of your Christian faith in such a large public monument is, I think, an important thing to acknowledge. And go to the next one. What we discovered, to my amazement, as we put the show together, and selected very carefully works that would refer to other things so that everything builds as you go through the show, is that we by accident borrowed extensively from one family of medieval Armenia. We borrowed works made for or by the Procian family. We borrowed a relief carving to show the type of sculptural decoration that was on the facades of many churches, and discovered that it was actually made for Amir Hassan, a member of the Proch family. As Christina Moranche, another of the catalog authors, points out, this pose is found centuries earlier on the Armenian church of Marin, a church possibly built by the Emperor Heraclius of the Byzantine world, who is himself Armenian, and that you can then go back another half millennium earlier and find these type of poses on works that would have been of the era of King Tridot. It's a very long continuum, and it's a very important monument in Sunik, the Church of the White Virgin, and it probably was erected in 1321 as Amir Hassan finished the church that was begun by his father, who is in the medallion at the bottom of this large gold reliquary, praying as you did just a few minutes ago. And he gave the reliquary to the monument, to the monastery of the vegetarians. So we've never been able to find a truly elegant name for it. What it is, as you all will recognize, is a container for a small hand cross. And that hand cross has at its center the white oval is a rock crystal covering pieces of the true cross. And in the Middle Ages, there is no higher, more desirable gift to be given to anybody in any of the Christian communities in the world than relics of the true cross. And Father Ashaki, the head of the museums at Etchmiadzin, who lent, Etchmiadzin itself lent a number of works to the show, in his entry on the work, suggested that it might be relics that by tradition were brought by Saint Ripsame, whom King Tridot attacked, or by a princess of Sunik who presumably was given bits of the true cross when the Emperor Heraclius goes by Armenia as he has gone to Persia to regain the true cross in the early 600s as it's been stolen or taken in battle by the Persians, and he takes it back, he takes it to Jerusalem, and then ultimately to the capital of the Roman Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. And either one of those is certainly possible by tradition. There are also records of later Byzantine emperors giving pieces of the true cross to Armenians. While you may think that these don't look very big, they were as important an object as a Byzantine emperor could give to anyone, and the reliquaries in Western Europe that have pieces this size are studied extensively and with great interest. As this is happening, what we realize is that the Proch, the Orbelians, the Zacharians, are becoming incredibly powerful running the trade routes for the Mongols. And that is probably the reason that both of these images look somewhat Mongol-like. And we know from my dissertation area, the Kingdom of Cilicia, that Mongols, when they were involved in agreements with polities that they had respected, they gave them a Mongol wife. So probably Emir Hassan's mother may have been a Mongol, and quite possibly even his father had one, but it was a sign of rank and importance. And go to the next one. And as that type of thing is occurring in Greater Armenia, around 1000, the Byzantine world forces a large number of Armenians from what is now in Western Turkey to move to the Mediterranean coast. And they are settled in Cilicia, and originally they are under the control of the Byzantines, but as you all know, King Levon around 1198 manages through the Crusaders to get a king's crown from the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and then the Emperor of Byzantium gives him a crown too. And from 1200 for most of the 13th century, you will increasingly be the most powerful Christian nation in the East, because Constantinople will fall to the Crusaders and you have the Latin Empire. The rulers of Byzantium will be closely allied with Crusader states in many different ways, and as I argued in my dissertation, King Hetum, a successor of Levon, will be closely allied with particularly Louis IX, King of France, who builds the glorious Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. So we brought what one has from Cilicia, which is primarily absolutely fantastic manuscripts, and put them in a gallery that followed the monumental architecture of Greater Armenia, and then liturgical objects of Greater Armenia are what you can see through at the far end. So the next, my dissertation was on Cilician manuscripts, so I love each and every one of them that we were able to borrow, and they tell the type of interweaving with other cultures that Armenia has on the Silk Road. On the far left is a small manuscript of the writings of St. Gregory of Narek. This is the first manuscript in which he is called a saint. It was done by, actually done by Nerses of Lambron, one of the great theologians coming out of the Cilician world, and it was used in the development of the ideas of how to create saints for the in memory of the genocide. And it was also one of the images of Narek, who was recently named by Pope Francis as one of the great fathers of the church. He's standing in the prayer pose, being blessed by Christ, and perhaps Christ holds his writings in his hand. It's a very Byzantine Roman, we are as good as the Empire of the Romans image, and that's repeated in the next work where the young Prince Levon, named after King Levon, is being married to Princess Karan, both of them of the Hetumen dynasty, and all the pose on that manuscript, all the format is what Byzantine royals would have, and the young prince's dress is that of a Byzantine emperor, but his wife and he are dressed in these elaborate silks that are the driving force of the trade routes. That work is by Taras Roslin, Armenia's greatest artist of the Middle Ages, and it came to our exhibition through the incredibly generous loan of the Brotherhood of St. James in Jerusalem. And we tremendously appreciated it, Father Samuel, for bringing it. The Narek image and the one at the far right that we'll get to are from the Montenegro, which lent very, very generously. And then there were a few works that came from other institutions. So the next image, the third one over, is from the Morgan Library in New York, and it is showing Prince Levon's uncle, Johannes, whose brother is Hetum I, and he is introducing actually relatives of Prince Levon's wife to the Virgin and Child in a pose that's very, very Italian of the 13th century. And Johannes is wearing the fleur-de-lis of France, and we juxtaposed it in the show to Johannes 20 years later, wearing his robes where the lowest level of them has the dragon of Asian origin. And to me, we argued in the show, it's the two ends of the trade route for you at this time, that you move the silk goods from the Mongols in the Far East, and you move them as far west as France, which is one of the most, or is the most powerful force in the West. You are the point where people come into the Mongol-controlled Pax Mongolica. Marco Polo goes to the east through Ios, which is part of the Cilician kingdom. So it is a very important element. And if we go to the next one, and because I love manuscripts, you get one more slide. But one of the things we always talk about with medieval artists is that they don't promote themselves. And I am here to tell you, Armenian artists did not know about that. So, on the left, at the far corner of the manuscript, the man that's seated is Sarkis Pitsak, the artist. And you are actually looking at him draw Hakam II, the Catholicos of the Armenian Church. And it's at the beginning of the Gospels in a Bible that Pizzak did. So at the top you have St. Matthew. And if you look, Sarkis Pizzak has positioned himself very much like St. Matthew. So he's also inscribed his name. There is no way that you don't know that he considers himself, who is a married priest, to be an important figure. And what will be happening in these next two works is what happens to the kingdom of Cilicia, as the Armenians, with this very strong and very successful alliance with the Mongols, begin to suffer what is happening to the Mongols as the Mamluks, a surprise authority coming out of Egypt, move north, taking lands. And when they move and take each of the Crusader states, when they get to Cilicia, a certain number of the Armenians go to Italy, where they are connected with the Catholic Church, particularly the Franciscans. And so you have the manuscript in the middle, which is showing you the Apocalypse, and it was actually done by Armenians in the late 1200s, but in Bologna, Italy. So one group of Armenians are resettling there, and at the upper right, you have the very beautiful portrait of St. Gregory of Tatev, a leaf done on parchment, so we know that it doesn't actually belong to the manuscript it's in, which is written on paper, so you can tell easily. And that manuscript is written in Kaffa, in the Crimea, because as the Armenians are driven out of Cilicia, one group, probably those most intimately involved in trade, move to the Crimea, so they move from the north shore of the Mediterranean to the north shore of the Black Sea, where the Mongols still have a dominant trade route, so that they are moving to where they move their trade route to work with the Mongol trade route that's coming out of Greater Armenia. And it's a very successful Armenian community there for many centuries in the next. And you are back into that world of the Armenians that trade into Crimea. And we were able to put up a large and rotating photograph of the outside of the church at Lake Savan, of the 40 apostles. We had hoped to show you the inside of it, and Hawk had done a series of wonderful photographs of the inside and of the outside, but our technical people couldn't make the inside work, so what we got instead was the flowers of summer and the dry grasses of winter in a moving thing that many people found quite compelling. We put it with liturgical music that Father Ashakik had suggested, and as you took the audio guide of the show, there were stops in which the inscriptions on works were read in classical Armenian so that people would know of the breadth of Armenian culture, because you have incredibly beautiful music. And I thought the two most important things to mention from this gallery for you today was at the top, the Holy Lance, which when it is given to the monastery that is now Gegard in the beginning of the 13th century, immediately transforms that monastery into the site of the Holy Lance. It is a donation of the Prosh family. A thing that we don't normally think about in the Prosh family are buried at that monastery. The connection is not to St. Gregory the Illuminator, but to the very beginning of your connection to Christianity, because this is, of course, the lance thought to have pierced the side of Christ at his crucifixion. As Father Ashakik notes, it is not the only claim of lance that claims to be that, but it is one that needs to be studied more in conjunction to that debate. The one that we had in our show and the one you see on the slide was made in 1700. So the actual lance never left Etchmiadzin. And then at the lower right, you have the center of the banner that in 1448 becomes the symbol of the Catholicos when the Catholicos returns to Etchmiadzin. And as with the stele at the beginning of the show, the other side shows Christ enthroned in a symbol that you could see throughout the Christian world. And then on the reverse, you have Gregory the Illuminator in the center, flanked by King Tridot, now a handsome man. And then To the right, Saint Ripsime, the woman who he violates, and she is holding her martyr's cross that leads him and the Armenian people to become Christian. And next. So I happen to love Monastery Tatev. And as we used images throughout the show to try to make people understand what your country is like, this was the image that we used in the last of the galleries that could talk about Armenians as having relatively independent kingdoms. And we did that gallery as a scriptorium because manuscripts are what was important to the Armenians, and the end of the Middle Ages will be in the last gallery when you move from manuscripts to printed books. What was quite marvelous is, of course, Tatev is a great scriptorium. Its works are very famous. St. Gregory of Tatev was here. If you go to his funeral chapel, which is along the wall of the church here, a copy of that image is hanging over the door. Can we have the next one, please? And we were able to put together a small body of manuscripts that give you a sense of what it was to be a scribe in an Armenian scriptorium in a monastic setting in the Middle Ages. So the Getty Museum lent us this wonderful leaf, which is, of course, blown up too much so you can see it better. But on the upper left, the scribe Petros has just finished copying for himself the Gospels, and he is handing his ink pot to his pupil, Myrtos, who will now be the scribe of the monastery. And he is writing about the work he did and how much he appreciated his assistants, who were like saints in the degree to which they polished the paper he wrote on, because Armenians use paper early, and the more polished the paper is, the better it holds the ink as a sharp, clear line. So polishing paper is incredibly important. And it would seem that in recognition of them, in this manuscript where he draws the two men at the bottom, he gives them halos so that you know that he thinks of them as saints. And the red and green thing that look like giant beer mugs are actually heavy stone polishers that you hold and you polish. So you're looking at how the paper that is increasingly what manuscripts are written on is made, how one generation teaches the next. And then beside it, the monastery of the Mecharis Fathers of San Lazzaro in Jerusalem, in Venice, wrong place, lent us one of the few model books that survives from the Middle Ages. And you have this weird animal, which is made of lots of little animals jammed into a shape in that book. And then you have it exactly copied in the book at the far right, which is from the Brotherhood of St. James in Jerusalem. And then we had another one that showed it copied less accurately. So you see an idea of being made in the Lake Van region, and then moving, and next. I am going to finish on time. We finished this gallery with one other manuscript that's an Alexander romance, like on the far right previously. This is the story of Alexander the Great. This idea that Armenians didn't know about the larger world has no evidence supported. About the same moment you get the alphabet developed by Mesrop Mashtats, the Alexander romance, the really wonderful version of what Alexander the Great did, where he flies through the skies and gets swallowed by giant crabs and comes out of it, is translated into Armenian. And we know that there are Armenians at the major intellectual centers of the ancient world. So because I loved it when I found it looking through the manuscripts to pick what to show it when I was in Yerevan, I just thought it was too great not to show, and almost every reviewer showed it, so I'm not the only one that thought it was a sign of the Armenians. But we also have these two manuscripts beside it. With all of the major artists, we tried to have several works so that you would think of these people as artists, not as an exemplifier of the Armenians, but of the artist with his own style who worked within an Armenian milieu. So Taras Roslin, Sarkis Pitsak, and here Hakab of Yofa, who, like Sarkis Pitsak, won't you know what he looks like? He paints himself at the lower left corner of the middle image, and he's wearing a giant turban and loose, voluminous robes, and it must have been what the Armenian merchant elite were wearing in Amsterdam, around the world, in India at that time. It is a style that is known as the Armenian style, and we have records of people ordering clothes in the Armenian merchant style. It was a specific, it wasn't something you were forced to wear, but it was something that by wearing it, you identified a kinship. So Hakab has put himself at the base of the crosses, of the trumpets calling for the second coming. The inscription, he identifies himself, and he seems to be fairly sure he's going to do okay with the second coming. And then he did this wonderful series of images in the manuscript at the upper right of the creation of the world. So you should know that the bug-eyed man is God. And it is on the last day of creation, and he's looking at the creatures of Ezekiel's vision right at the tip of his fingers, who go on to be the evangelist symbols. And then the facing page is the gates of heaven. And you have those two rectangular, rather Hachikar-like doors, and then the little tiny head of God, he's shrunk, welcome you into paradise, which you will attain by reading the Gospels and following them and being saved by Christ's sacrifice, which is commemorated on all these Hachikars that we see. And next. Hakab of Jolfa was a man who lived in the city of Jolfa in the Ottoman Empire. And he also will ultimately, in the time frame of the exhibition, live in the city of New Jolfa, which is a forced creation of the Persian Empire. Our last two galleries show the Armenian sites that we could find major loan source, so not all Armenian sites, in the Ottoman Empire as the Ottomans expand to, by the early 1500s, controlling all of North Africa, Yemen, all the way up the Mediterranean, and of course over to the borders of Persia. We picked works that we could see a point that we could make to the public. So at the upper left, you have a plaque, that's now a book cover, that shows the making of the Holy Mirror. And why we borrowed it for the show is the Catholicos and his two immediate prelates with him are all holding arm reliquaries. And the first arm reliquary comes into Armenia in Cilicia. I showed it and forgot to talk about it. And it comes from Western Europe. It's a tradition of body part reliquaries that develops in the Catholic Church of Europe. It's the first one that comes is St. Nicholas. We're not totally sure why, but there were not of popes of Rome named Nicholas who were Franciscans, and the Franciscans are very, very successful in Cilicia. The arm reliquary becomes increasingly, as you all know, a symbol of the authority of the Armenian Church. So the holding of this reliquary, the stirring of the mirror with the right arm of Gregory the Illuminator is still relevant today. So we have Sis, which is no longer capital of a kingdom, but still has Catholicos, is still important to Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. And then at the lower left, we have a lovely little gold pyx in the show that was from where Gregory the Illuminator was born in Kayseri, which is also where Mr. Gulbenkian was born, and it's the Gulbenkian Library in Portugal. Thank you. That lent us this pyx. I feel so certain that Mr. Gulbenkian was very happy to buy for himself a gold pyx that was made in the city, which is an important city on the trade routes and a major center of Armenian metalwork. And of course, at the lower right is a little egg, whose exact use we're still not sure of, but they seem to be votive gifts that came from Kütahya, a site that Armenians are very active at in the Ottoman Empire. And our catalog author, Suzanne Yalman, was arguing that Kütahya introduces Chinese motifs into Turkish Ottoman ceramics, probably from Armenians migrating during Persian civil wars to the relative safety of Turkey, so that you are bringing motifs in that then blend with motifs that are already there. And the most wonderful object, the largest, most compelling in this gallery of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, short of the map that we'll see in a second, is the church curtain that you see covering the right-hand side of the screen. This shows holy sites in Jerusalem. And when I borrowed it, I thought I was showing you woodblock prints made for the Armenians as you control the textile trade in India. However, this was made in Tokat, so I was not able to give you one made in India. But on the upper left, you see the monastery of St. James, and where there's a lot of bloppy red, you can't really tell it, but the head of St. James is there. And then on the upper right, you have the Holy Sepulchre, and on the bands between that part and the church service below, you have the donors, and you have the sites identified, so that maybe people who had been pilgrims to Jerusalem ordered it and sent it to Tokat. We don't know enough about its history, but it's one of the many works that came from Etchmiadzin, while the plaque at the upper left is one of the number of very, very generous loans from the Great House of Cilicia. And the plaque covers a early 14th century manuscript, which in its rituals includes as much of a description of how to make a saint as survives. And so it too was important in the decision to create the icons that go with the 2015 celebration of the genocide. And the next one. And then any of you who got to New York certainly saw what occupied the entire middle of the room for the Ottoman Empire. This, although across the bottom is a map of the Ottoman Empire and every Armenian church in it, which is about 800, in 1691, when a gentleman from Bologna, and you saw the Bolognese manuscript of 1300, so you are 400 years later nearly, orders an Armenian who's a leading figure in the intellectual life of Constantinople and who works for the church to provide him with this map. And at the far left end is Constantinople and the Bosporus. The large green blob in the middle is Lake Van, so the little bit of red that you can see in it is Akhtamar. And then up to the top from there is, you probably can't see it, but there's a figure that looks like he came out of Brigadoon, big mustache, and that's Gregory the Illuminator, destroying the idols of Mush. And the idol looks like it came out of a bad sci-fi movie. And then at the lower right here, at the very edge, as in the map that we saw in the beginning, you have Mount Ararat, the edge of the world. Only by now we know they know exactly what's on the other side. It's Persia. But you see the figures which I repeated up at the top. It is a figure, a potentate, probably a Turk, but possibly a wealthy Armenian, being hosted by a group of Armenian clerics right beside Etchmiadzin, and above it, one at the top is the Church of St. Ripsime. They're very, very accurate drawings. And what we, by the accident of my planning the installation without realizing how wonderful it would be, it was opposite the hanging that was lent to us most generously from the audience hall in Etchmiadzin, which was given to Etchmiadzin in the early 1700s by people from New Julfa, possibly because New Julfa was putting a lot of money into the restoration of Etchmiadzin in that period. But you can look at the view of Etchmiadzin on it and on the drawing and the photograph from today and see that portions of it are very, very similar. And the picture of today and the map of 1691 both show this, the 17th century bell tower. What we particularly loved when we were borrowing it, the altar hanging for is at the left, you have King Tridot with his boar's head again, by Gregory the Illuminator, standing high, and an archangel showing him Agathongelos' description of the founding of the first Christian church in Armenia, Christ descending from the heavens, as you all should know by now, that was the symbol of the exhibition, to strike the ground for the churches to be built. But we're not seeing the bare ground. Two angels up at the top are revealing what the church had become by the time of the donation. So you're seeing Etchmiadzin as it was when the donation was made, not the moment of Agathongelos' telling. And we have the next one. I am closing in. As you all know, in 1604, after a period in which the Persians and the Ottomans fight over their border intensely, so that Armenians and others living in that region are perpetually threatened, the Shah Abbas, establishing a new dynasty in Persia, wanting to be financially powerful, invades the Ottoman lands and takes the city of Julfa, because Julfa's merchants control the Silk Roads. And as Ina McCabe, one of the catalog authors, points out, Julfa, a city that most of us could not locate now, was on international maps, because that's where you went to get to the heart of the control of the silk trade. And so Shah Abbas forces the Armenians of Julfa to move to his new capital, Isfahan, to help him gain control of the most valuable commodity of the time, silk. So it's like oil today. And it was a forced march. If you were wealthy and rode in a carriage, it was probably not that unpleasant. If you walked, you did not necessarily live to reach Isfahan. So it was both a very horrible experience and one which led in a very short period of time to the Armenians winning control of all external trade done by the Persian Empire. So anybody that wished to do trade with Persia met with the Armenians, who originally live in Isfahan and then quickly are settled in a section across the river, now a large drainage ditch, that is New Julfa. And that is so significant to what ideas come into Persia, that when the British Museum a few years ago had a major exhibition on Shah Abbas's Persia, the first works in the show were Armenians, because ideas came in through the Armenians. And it's also a perfect place to see how you did what you do now and have done over the centuries, combine the past with the present. The gentleman at the upper left may be the Catholicos Jacob IV. I seem to have done well on Jacobs in the show. He was drawn by a very prominent Muslim artist and probably was in a book of people who are in Isfahan. And he was born in, if it is Jacob, he was born in Isfahan and then is made Catholicos in Etchmiadzin and returns to have the Shah confirm him in his title. These wealthy Khojahs, the merchants who, with this control of the Persian international trade, increasingly expand into India, ultimately control internal and external textile trade in India, expand further, Myanmar, Bangladesh, the Philippines, moving that way to get trade goods, and then moving the trade goods all the way to Amsterdam and England. Both are the force that will support our last slide, the printing of the first Armenian Bible, but they also want to remember the past. Back one. Got ahead on me. A quick review of everything I said. There's going to be a pop quiz after this.
It was there.
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 No, back one more, I'm sorry. That one. The lower left is a manuscript that was written in New Julfa, but the 2 pages of the canon tables you're looking at are precisely copied from the Gladsar Gospel that is now at UCLA, that we know from colophons was in New Jaffa at that time. So you're copying a manuscript of the early 1300s and a manuscript of the 1600s to connect to your roots. While on other pages in that manuscript, somebody's got a European herbal and you've got Albrecht Dürer looking flowers. So the two are together, and then on the right we have it, because I hope all of you can recognize that the head is the cover of the catalog. It's St. John the Evangelist in the Late Bond style, again being carried to a new level in Persia, and now the next one. And at this time, what also happens is you are finally able to do what Armenians have been trying to do for many, many years, which is to join the world of the post-medieval times and have printed books. Printed books are incredibly expensive. Persian and Turkish governments are not fond of people having printing presses because it lets information flow too easily. And the first printed work in Armenian is actually the little tiny manuscript at the upper left, which may have been for merchants. It's certainly an amalgam of things that are more amuletic than they are devout prayers. But this first printed book that is extensive is not done in Venice, probably because of the Catholic censors. It's done in Amsterdam, where the censors were a little bit less strict. It's done, as you know, in 1666. It's the Ashkan Bible. We were pleased to be able to borrow the one in the diocese so that we had the Armenian church represented in that loan. And with it comes a whole series of images. They're the type of images that are on the churches in New Jaffa, on the gold picks we borrowed from the Gulbenkian. They're not by Armenian artists. They're by a man named Christopher von Sickham, who does woodblock prints and sells them to anybody printing a Bible. Armenians buy the woodblocks themselves, so that some of those woodblocks, as Sylvie Marion pointed out to me, have reached Constantinople. And with that, it's not the illuminated manuscripts in, or all aspects of the past in, but Armenia moves into the world of the printed book, and the trade routes continue. And this merchant elite of